The moment Rebecca Sterling saw the elderly woman breaking her only piece of bread in half to share with a stranger's child, something inside her chest cracked open like ice splitting under spring sun. It was a Tuesday morning in downtown Seattle, the kind of grey, drizzling day that made the city's glass towers look like they were dissolving into the clouds. Rebecca had carved out exactly 47 minutes from her impossible schedule to take her 5-year-old son, Thomas, to their usual cafe on Pine Street, a rare pocket of normalcy in the chaos of running a tech company worth $200 million. The cafe hummed with the soundtrack of privilege, espresso machines hissing, designer handbags clicking against marble tables, conversations about stock portfolios and European vacations. Rebecca barely noticed anymore. This was her world, polished, efficient, measured in quarterly earnings and board meetings. Thomas sat across from her in his pressed button-down shirt, his small hands wrapped around a cup of hot chocolate topped with whipped cream. He had her serious blue eyes and her ex-husband's stubborn chin. At 5 years old, he already carried himself with a quietness that worried her sometimes, too composed, too aware of being the CEO's son at the company daycare, too careful not to make demands on her limited time. "Mummy, can we stay a little longer today?" His voice was small, hopeful. Rebecca glanced at her Apple Watch. 3 emails from her CFO, 2 missed calls from the head of product development. A board meeting in 90 minutes that would determine whether they'd secure the venture capital needed for their next expansion. "We'll see, sweetheart," she said, the automatic response of every parent who meant no but couldn't bear to say it. She reached across to wipe a chocolate moustache from his upper lip with her napkin, a gesture performed while her other hand scrolled through her phone, already mentally drafting responses to the crisis du jour. That's when she noticed them. In the corner booth near the rain-streaked window, partially hidden behind a concrete support column, sat an elderly woman and a young boy. The contrast to Rebecca's own table was stark enough to make her pause mid-scroll. The woman appeared to be in her 70s, maybe older. It was hard to tell beneath the weight of obvious hardship. Her grey hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, strands escaping around a face mapped with deep lines that spoke of decades of struggle. She wore a cardigan that had once been beige but had faded to the colour of old newspaper, its cuffs frayed, one button missing and replaced with what looked like a safety pin. Beneath it, a faded blue shirt that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone thin and soft. But it was her hands that caught Rebecca's attention, gnarled, work-worn hands with swollen knuckles, the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime doing physical labour. Those hands now held a single plate. On it sat what appeared to be the cafe's cheapest item, a small piece of wheat bread, lightly toasted, with a thin scraping of butter. Nothing else, no eggs, no fruit, no side of bacon, just bread. And next to the plate, a single glass of water. Tap water, not the sparkling Pellegrino that came in green bottles at the tables around them. The boy sitting with her was perhaps 7 or 8, wearing a checkered shirt that was clean but obviously too small, the sleeves stopping well above his wrists. His dark hair needed cutting, falling into eyes that held a kind of watchful wariness Rebecca recognized from children who'd learned too young that the world wasn't safe. What happened next made Rebecca's phone slip forgotten onto the table. The elderly woman picked up the piece of bread, her only piece of bread, the only food on the table, and with careful, deliberate movements, broke it in half. Not roughly, but with an almost ceremonial gentleness, as if this small act carried weight beyond the physical gesture. She held out the larger half to the boy. He shook his head, his young face serious. Rebecca couldn't hear their words over the cafe's ambient noise, but she could read the conversation in their body language. The boy was refusing, the woman was insisting, Back and forth, a quiet negotiation over half a piece of bread that probably cost less than the foam art on Rebecca's $12 latte. Finally, the boy accepted it. But he didn't eat. Instead, he waited until the woman took a bite of her half, and only then did he bring his own piece to his mouth. They ate slowly, making each bite last, washing it down with small sips of water between them. Rebecca felt something uncomfortable twist in her stomach, not quite guilt, not quite shame, but something adjacent to both. Around her, the cafe continued its performance of casual affluence. The woman at the next table was complaining that her almond milk cappuccino wasn't hot enough. Two men in expensive suits were laughing about their golf handicaps. A teenager was Instagramming her acai bowl, adjusting the lighting for the perfect shot. And in the corner, an elderly woman and a child were making a single piece of bread into a shared meal, treating it with the reverence Rebecca's social circle reserved for Michelin-starred tasting menus. "Mommy," Thomas had followed her gaze, "why is that lady sharing her food?" The question, delivered in his clear, innocent voice, felt like an arrow finding its mark. Why indeed? In Thomas's limited experience, food was abundant, always available, often thrown away when he didn't finish it. The concept of sharing not from generosity, but from necessity, was outside his frame of reference. "Because," Rebecca started, then stopped. "How did you explain poverty to a 5-year-old who lived in a world where every need was met before he even knew he had it?" "Because she's being kind. But she looks hungry, Mommy. Her hands are shaking." Rebecca looked again, and Thomas was right. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she brought the bread to her mouth, not dramatically, but with the fine tremor of someone whose blood sugar was too low, whose body was running on empty. The realization hit Rebecca like cold water. This wasn't just a light breakfast. This might be the only meal this woman would have today, maybe tomorrow too, and she was dividing it in half to feed a child who wasn't even her own. Rebecca thought of the breakfast she'd skipped that morning, not because she couldn't afford it, but because she was too busy, a phrase she wore like armor. She thought of the fully stocked refrigerator in her Queen Anne Hill townhouse, the meal delivery service that left prepared dinners on her doorstep 3 times a week, most of which she threw away uneaten. She thought of the company cafeteria at her office building, where employees could eat gourmet meals for free all day long, and how she'd heard some of her executives complaining about the menu options. The disparity was obscene, and she was suddenly painfully aware of it. "Can we give them our food?" Thomas asked, his small hand reaching for the untouched croissant on their table, the one Rebecca had ordered out of habit rather than hunger. "Thomas, we can't just—" Rebecca began, then stopped herself. Why couldn't they? What rule said you couldn't offer food to someone who clearly needed it? Only the unspoken social contract of polite society, which suddenly seemed far less important than a child's instinct for basic human decency. But even as she considered it, Rebecca felt the familiar anxiety of her position. She was Rebecca Sterling, CEO of TechVista Solutions, a woman who'd been featured in Forbes and Business Insider, who'd given a TED Talk on female leadership, who sat on 2 non-profit boards. Every action she took in public was scrutinized, photographed, potentially viral. What if the elderly woman was offended? What if someone filmed the interaction and it ended up on social media, framed as either condescending charity or performative generosity? What if— "Mommy, she's crying." Rebecca's spiraling thoughts stopped abruptly. She looked back at the corner booth. The elderly woman had her head bowed, and yes, there were tears sliding down her weathered cheeks, dropping onto the empty plate before her. The boy had noticed too, and was patting her arm with his small hand, trying to comfort her with the earnest clumsiness of a child. In that moment, watching an elderly woman cry over an empty plate while surrounded by a room full of people with more food than they could eat, Something fundamental shifted in Rebecca's carefully constructed worldview. All the metrics she used to measure success, stock options, revenue growth, market share, media mentions, suddenly seemed like elaborate distractions from something far more basic and true. Thomas was already sliding out of his chair, croissant in hand, moving with the uncomplicated certainty of someone too young to have learned that compassion was complicated. "Thomas, wait!" Rebecca reached for his arm, but he was already walking across the cafe, his small figure weaving between tables, heading straight for the corner booth with the directness that only children possess. Rebecca's heart hammered. Every eye in the cafe seemed to turn toward her son. Her phone buzzed with another message, probably her CFO wondering where she was, but for once she didn't look at it. She stood, her legs unsteady, and followed her 5-year-old son as he did what she'd been too paralyzed by social anxiety to do. Thomas reached the booth and held out the croissant. "Excuse me," he said in his careful, polite voice. "Would you like this? We have extra." The elderly woman looked up, her tear-stained face registering surprise, then something more complex, a mixture of gratitude, embarrassment, and a bone-deep weariness that made Rebecca's throat tight. "Oh, sweetheart," the woman said, her voice rough with emotion and what sounded like a lifetime of cigarettes or hard living or both. "That's very kind, but please," Thomas insisted with the stubborn generosity of someone who didn't yet understand pride or shame. "My mommy always says we should share." The woman's eyes lifted from Thomas to Rebecca, who had arrived at the booth and now stood frozen, her CEO confidence nowhere to be found, just a mother watching her son be braver than she'd been. Their eyes met, two women from completely different worlds, connected by a moment neither had planned. And in that connection, Rebecca saw something that would haunt her long after she left the cafe. Not gratitude or resentment, but recognition. As if the elderly woman was seeing not Rebecca Sterling, CEO and success story, but simply another human being, and finding her wanting. The silence that followed felt like it stretched for hours, though it could only have been seconds. That suspended moment when Rebecca Sterling, CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, stood before an elderly woman crying over an empty plate and realized she had no script for this. "I'm Margaret," the woman said finally, her voice steadier than Rebecca expected. She wiped her eyes with the back of one gnarled hand, a gesture that somehow maintained dignity despite everything. "And this is Danny." She placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "He's my neighbor's grandson. His mama works 2 shifts today, so I'm watching him." The way Margaret said watching him made Rebecca's chest tighten. This wasn't babysitting in the way Rebecca understood it, dropping Thomas at a facility with certified caregivers, activities scheduled down to the minute, organic snacks portioned in containers. This was an elderly woman in obvious poverty, taking responsibility for a child when she barely had enough for herself. "I'm Rebecca," she heard herself say, though her throat felt tight. "And this is Thomas." Thomas, still holding the croissant, looked up at his mother with those serious blue eyes. "Can they have it, Mummy? Please?" Margaret shook her head, even as her eyes lingered on the pastry with an hunger that was painful to witness. "That's very sweet, honey, but we're fine. We just finished eating." It was a lie delivered with such gentle firmness that Rebecca understood it wasn't really about the food. It was about preserving whatever shred of dignity remained when you were breaking bread in half because you couldn't afford more. Margaret was protecting something far more fragile than her empty stomach, but Thomas, with the persistent logic of a 5-year-old, wasn't finished. "You were crying, though. My mummy cries sometimes when she's sad or hungry. She says she forgets to eat because she's busy with work." Rebecca felt heat flood her face. The casual way Thomas had just exposed her own dysfunction, skipping meals, not from necessity, but from a twisted relationship with productivity, felt like being stripped bare in front of a stranger who had real reasons to be hungry. "Thomas," she said quietly, but Margaret's expression had already shifted. Something knowing flickered across her weathered face. "Busy, huh?" Margaret's voice carried no judgment, just a kind of weary understanding. "I remember those days. Back when I was working 3 jobs, trying to keep the lights on after my husband passed. Used to forget to eat too. Different reasons maybe, but same result. Running yourself into the ground." The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Here was Rebecca, thinking she was so different, so important, so uniquely burdened by her responsibilities, and this woman who'd worked 3 jobs, not to build an empire but to survive, was gently pointing out they might not be as different as Rebecca assumed. Danny, who'd been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. His voice was soft but clear. "Miss Margaret shares everything with me, even when she only has a little bit." He looked at Thomas with something like pride. "She's the kindest person I know." The simple declaration, delivered with such earnest conviction, made Rebecca feel something crack further inside her chest. When was the last time someone had described her as the kindest person they knew? Her employees respected her, feared her perhaps, admired her business acumen. But kind, that word had gotten lost somewhere between building her company and building her reputation. "Please," Rebecca said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "Let us buy you both breakfast, a real breakfast. It would mean a lot to Thomas." She paused, then added with careful honesty, "And to me." Margaret studied her for a long moment, and Rebecca had the uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen. Not as CEO Rebecca Sterling with her perfect bob and designer suit, but as someone far more vulnerable and lost than she usually allowed anyone to perceive. "You don't have to," Margaret began. "I know I don't have to," Rebecca interrupted, then softened her tone. "I want to. Please, let me do this one decent thing this morning." The one decent thing hung in the air between them, and Rebecca realized how much that phrase revealed. One decent thing, as if decency were a rare commodity in her life, something she had to schedule between conference calls and investor meetings. Margaret's resistance seemed to waver. She looked at Danny, who was watching the exchange with the careful attention of a child used to reading adult emotions for signs of danger or safety. Whatever Margaret saw in Rebecca's face must have passed some internal test, because she finally nodded. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you, that's very generous." The relief Rebecca felt was disproportionate to the gesture. It was just breakfast, an expense that wouldn't even register in her monthly budget. But somehow, having Margaret accept felt like absolution for something Rebecca couldn't quite name. "Can I sit with Danny?" Thomas asked, already sliding into the booth next to the older boy without waiting for permission. The 2 children regarded each other with that frank curiosity unique to kids who hadn't yet learned to be suspicious of differences. "Do you like dinosaurs?" Thomas asked. "I like robots," Danny replied. "I like both," Thomas declared, solving the potential conflict with 5-year-old diplomacy. Rebecca found herself sitting across from Margaret, who looked decidedly uncomfortable now that the moment had shifted from desperate need to social interaction. The cafe's noise swirled around them, espresso machines, conversations, the rain intensifying against the windows, but their booth felt insulated, separate. "What can I get you?" Rebecca asked, picking up the menu, even though she'd memorized it years ago. "Anything you want." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the menu, and Rebecca realized this might be the first time in a long time, maybe ever, that someone had said those words to her and meant them. "Anything you want. What a privilege to have that be true. Margaret's eyes scanned the laminated pages, and Rebecca watched as she passed over item after item, clearly calculating costs in her head, even though Rebecca had said she'd pay. Finally, she pointed to one of the cheapest items, the basic breakfast plate: 2 eggs, toast, a small portion of hash browns. "That would be wonderful," Margaret said. "And for Danny, maybe the same?" Rebecca flagged down their server, a young woman with purple streaks in her hair and tired eyes that suggested she was working her way through college. "We'll have 2 of the deluxe breakfast platters," Rebecca said, deliberately choosing the more expensive option, "with sides of fruit, bacon, sausage, and fresh orange juice. Also, hot coffee and hot chocolate for the boys." "Rebecca," Margaret started to protest, but Rebecca held up a hand. "You're doing me a favor," Rebecca said, and found she meant it, "letting me feel like a decent human being for once. Let me overshoot, please." Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, but she blinked them back and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means." But as Rebecca looked at this woman, who'd been willing to split her only piece of bread with a neighbor's child, who wore threadbare clothes but maintained her dignity, who cried from hunger but still tried to refuse charity, Rebecca thought maybe she was beginning to understand what it meant. Not fully. She couldn't pretend a single breakfast somehow made her comprehend the daily reality of poverty, but enough to feel the weight of her own excess. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said after the server left. Her voice was hesitant, as if she were crossing some invisible boundary. "What kind of work do you do? You mentioned being busy." Rebecca felt the familiar urge to deflect, to offer some vague answer that wouldn't highlight the vast economic chasm between them, but something about Margaret's direct gaze, weathered by years of hardship but still sharp and intelligent, demanded honesty. "I run a tech company," Rebecca said. "Software solutions for businesses. We have about 300 employees." Margaret nodded slowly, processing this. "So you're the boss, the big boss?" "Yes," Rebecca admitted, feeling strangely ashamed of it for the first time in her career. "Must be a lot of pressure," Margaret said, and there was no sarcasm in her voice, just genuine observation. "All those people depending on you for their livelihoods. That's a heavy thing to carry." The understanding in Margaret's words caught Rebecca off guard. She'd expected judgment, resentment maybe, or at the very least, incomprehension. Instead, Margaret seemed to grasp something that even Rebecca's own mother didn't understand: the weight of being responsible not just for her own survival, but for hundreds of families whose mortgages and healthcare and children's educations depended on decisions Rebecca made in boardrooms. "It is," Rebecca said quietly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in it." "I can see that," Margaret replied, gesturing vaguely at Rebecca's appearance, the perfectly styled hair, the designer suit, the expensive watch. "All that armor you're wearing must get heavy." The metaphor was so apt that Rebecca almost laughed. Yes, that's exactly what it was. Armor. Every perfectly chosen piece of clothing, every precisely maintained aspect of her appearance, every carefully modulated interaction, all of it designed to protect her from appearing weak or uncertain or human. "How do you do it?" Rebecca found herself asking. "How do you stay kind when life is so hard? Danny said you're the kindest person he knows. How do you maintain that when you're struggling just to eat?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, her gnarled fingers tracing the edge of the empty plate before her. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of lived experience. "Because if I don't stay kind, what do I have left? Money comes and goes. Lord knows I've learned that. Health fails. People leave or die. But who you are, how you treat others when nobody's watching, when there's nothing in it for you, that's what remains. That's the only wealth that really matters." Rebecca felt the words settle into her chest like stones dropping into water, sending ripples through everything she thought she knew about success and value and what made a life meaningful. She'd spent 15 years building a company, accumulating wealth, climbing ladders that seemed important, and yet sitting across from this elderly woman in a worn cardigan, Rebecca suddenly felt like the poor one. The food arrived then, steaming plates piled with eggs, bacon, sausage, golden hash browns, fresh fruit glistening with morning dew, toast with butter melting into its surface. The deluxe breakfast platters looked almost obscene in their abundance compared to the single piece of bread that had preceded them. Danny's eyes went wide. "Miss Margaret," he breathed, "look at all the food." Margaret's expression was complex. Gratitude mixed with something that might have been grief for all the mornings that hadn't looked like this, all the meals stretched too thin or skipped entirely. Her hands shook as she picked up her fork. "It's okay," Rebecca said softly. "Take your time. Enjoy it." And as Margaret took her first bite, closing her eyes as if to better savor it, Rebecca understood that she wasn't just providing a meal. She was offering dignity, respect, recognition that this woman's hunger mattered, that her life had value, that she deserved more than splitting bread in corners while the world looked away. Thomas and Danny were already eating with the efficient focus of children, but between bites they were talking about robots and dinosaurs and their favorite colors and whether superheroes were real. The conversation had the easy flow of kids who hadn't yet learned that economic differences should create social barriers. Rebecca watched them and felt something shift in her understanding of what she was teaching her son. She'd been so focused on giving Thomas every advantage, the best schools, enrichment activities, travel experiences, but had she been teaching him to see people like Margaret and Danny? Or had she been inadvertently training him to look through them, to see poverty as someone else's problem, something that happened to other people in other places, not in cafes where he drank $12 hot chocolate? "Your boy has a good heart," Margaret said, noticing Rebecca's gaze. "You're raising him right." "I'm trying," Rebecca said, but the words felt hollow. Was she really? Or was Thomas's instinct to share the croissant something he possessed in spite of her example, not because of it? How many times had she walked past homeless people without making eye contact, rationalizing that she didn't carry cash, that there were systems in place to help them, that it wasn't her responsibility? How many times had she donated to charity more for the tax write-off than from genuine compassion? "It's hard raising kids alone," Margaret continued, and Rebecca realized this woman had gleaned her single mother status without Rebecca mentioning it. "I raised 3 boys after my husband died. Never enough money, never enough time, always feeling like I was failing them somehow." "How did they turn out?" Rebecca asked, genuinely curious. Margaret's face softened with maternal pride. "2 of them are doing real well, got good jobs, families of their own. My youngest—" She paused, and Rebecca saw grief flicker across her features. "He struggles. Made some bad choices, in and out of trouble, but he's still my son, and I love him just the same." The acceptance in Margaret's voice, loving her son despite his failures, despite whatever pain he'd caused her, made Rebecca think of her own father, who'd barely spoken to her since she'd divorced Thomas's father. In her family, failure wasn't accepted. Success was the only currency that bought affection. And yet, Margaret, who had so little, seemed to understand something about unconditional love that Rebecca's wealthy family had never grasped. "Do you see them often? Your sons?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "Not as much as I'd like. They're busy with their own lives. I understand. That's how it should be. Children growing up, moving on. But it gets lonely sometimes." The admission hung between them, and Rebecca heard the echo of her own future in those words. Would Thomas eventually grow up and grow away from her? Would she end up alone, having sacrificed genuine connection for career success, discovering too late that the ladder she'd been climbing led nowhere that mattered? Her phone buzzed insistently in her pocket, probably her CFO having a meltdown about her absence. The board meeting was in less than an hour now. She should be leaving, should be racing back to her office to prepare, to review the slides one more time, to armor up for battle in a conference room where millions of dollars hung on her performance. But Rebecca didn't move. For the first time in years, she chose to stay present in a moment that wasn't moving her career forward, wasn't building her brand, wasn't strategically valuable. She simply sat with Margaret and watched their sons eat breakfast, letting the board meeting and the venture capital and the stock options fade to background noise against something more immediate and real. Rebecca's phone had stopped buzzing 15 minutes ago, which somehow felt more ominous than the constant vibrations. The silence meant her CFO had given up trying to reach her, which meant the board meeting was probably starting without her, which meant, "You're worried about something," Margaret observed, her voice cutting through Rebecca's spiral of anxiety. Those weathered eyes missed nothing. "I can see it in your face. You keep looking at that watch like it's counting down to something." Rebecca glanced down at her Apple Watch, 10:47 a.m. The board meeting had started 7 minutes ago. 7 minutes of her carefully prepared presentation not being delivered. 7 minutes of questions she wasn't there to answer. 7 minutes of her CFO trying to cover for her unexplained absence. Her career, everything she'd built, might be crumbling in real time while she sat in a cafe eating breakfast with a stranger. "I'm missing something important," Rebecca admitted, "something that could determine my company's future." "But you're still here," Margaret said. It wasn't a question, just an observation that somehow felt profound. Yes, she was still here. Why? Rebecca had built her entire life around the principle that work came first, that success required sacrifice, that personal needs and other people's needs took a back seat to professional obligations. She'd missed Thomas's first words because she was in Tokyo closing a deal. She'd skipped her own mother's birthday dinner for an emergency board meeting. She'd trained herself to prioritize the abstract future over the immediate present, always, until today, until an elderly woman breaking bread in half had somehow short-circuited 15 years of conditioning. "My mummy's always missing things," Thomas said matter-of-factly through a mouthful of hash browns. "She missed my school play last month, and my soccer game, and parent day at my class." The words landed like physical blows. Rebecca had known she was missing these things, had felt guilty about it in an abstract way, but hearing Thomas list them so casually, as if her absence was simply a fact of his life to be accepted, made her stomach turn. "But it's okay," Thomas continued, his voice taking on that careful adult tone that children use when they're protecting their parents' feelings. "Mommy has important work. She's helping lots of people." The justification, Rebecca's own words, fed back to her by her 5-year-old son, sounded hollow now. Was she helping lots of people, or was she building wealth for investors and shareholders while neglecting the one person who actually needed her? Danny looked at Thomas with something like confusion. "But Miss Margaret always comes to my school stuff, even when she's tired or her legs hurt. She says I'm more important than anything else." The simple statement hung in the air like an indictment. Margaret, who could barely afford to eat, who wore clothes held together with safety pins, who had nothing by society's standards, she made Danny feel like the most important thing in her world. While Rebecca, with all her resources and opportunities, had taught Thomas to expect and accept her absence. "I'm not perfect," Margaret said quietly, looking at Rebecca with unexpected kindness. "Don't let this boy make me sound like a saint. I've made plenty of mistakes." I worked so much when my own boys were young that they practically raised themselves. I thought providing for them meant working every hour I could, bringing home every dollar. Took me too long to realize they didn't need more money. They needed more of me. Rebecca felt tears prick at her eyes. "But you learned," she said, her voice rough. "You figured it out." "Eventually," Margaret acknowledged. "After my youngest ended up in trouble, after years of him acting out, trying to get my attention, after it was almost too late. I learned, but at a cost I wouldn't wish on anyone." The warning implicit in Margaret's words was clear. Rebecca was walking the same path, making the same mistakes, heading toward the same regrets. The only difference was that Rebecca still had time to change course. The question was whether she had the courage to actually do it. Rebecca's phone lit up again, this time a text from her CFO. "Where are you? Board is furious. Call me now." Her hands trembled as she read it. This was it. The moment of reckoning. She could leave right now, race to the office, try to salvage the meeting and her reputation, offer some excuse about a family emergency, which in a way was true. Or she could stay, continue this conversation, keep sitting with the uncomfortable truths Margaret was reflecting back at her. She looked at Thomas, who was laughing at something Danny had said, his face lit up in a way she rarely saw anymore. When had he stopped laughing like that around her? When had their time together become scheduled obligations rather than joyful connections? "What would you do?" Rebecca asked Margaret. "If you were me right now, what would you choose?" Margaret took a long sip of her coffee, considering. "That's not really my place to say. Your life, your choices. But I'll tell you this. I'm 73 years old. I've been poor, I've been a little less poor, I've been back to poor again. I've lost people, lost opportunities, lost a lot of years to worry and struggle. And you know what I've never once regretted? The times I chose people over everything else. The times I said no to extra shifts so I could be at my grandson's birthday. The times I spent my last $20 on something to make someone smile instead of saving it. Those are the moments that meant something." She paused, her gnarled hands wrapping around the warm coffee mug. "But the times I chose work over people, the times I told myself I'd make it up later, the times I prioritized the urgent over the important, those are the regrets that keep me up at night. You can't get time back, Rebecca. You can't rewind and choose differently once the moment's passed." Rebecca felt something break open inside her chest. Not painfully, but like a shell cracking to let something out that had been trapped too long. She thought about the life she'd built, the impressive title, the stock options, the respect of her industry peers, the articles written about her success. And she thought about what that life had cost her, connection with her son, relationships with friends she'd gradually shed as too time-consuming, any sense of purpose beyond the next quarterly earnings report. What was she actually building? And for whom? Thomas had finished his breakfast and was showing Danny something on his smartwatch, some game or app that Danny watched with wide-eyed fascination, clearly having never seen technology like that before. The contrast between the two boys was stark. Thomas, with his designer clothes and expensive gadgets, given everything except consistent presents from his mother, and Danny, with his too small shirt and worn shoes, given nothing material, but treated like he mattered more than anything else in Margaret's world. Which boy was richer? The question wasn't as simple as Rebecca once would have thought. "Miss Margaret," Danny said suddenly, looking up from Thomas's watch. "Can Thomas come play at our apartment sometime? We could build robots with my cardboard boxes." Margaret's face flickered with something, embarrassment maybe, or shame at the thought of Thomas seeing where they lived. But she managed to smile. "That's up to Thomas's mommy, honey." Thomas turned to Rebecca with hopeful eyes. "Can I, Mommy? Please? Danny says they have a really cool fort made out of boxes." A month ago, a week ago, even an hour ago, Rebecca's instinct would have been to deflect with vague promises. We'll see, or maybe sometime, or Mommy will check her schedule. The parents' toolkit of non-committal responses that really meant no. But something had shifted. Rebecca looked at her son's hopeful face, at Danny's eager expression, at Margaret's careful neutrality that tried to hide her expectation of rejection, and she made a choice. Yes, Rebecca said. Not maybe, not someday. Yes, this weekend, if that works for Margaret. The surprise on Margaret's face was almost comical. You're serious. Completely serious, Rebecca confirmed, and as she said it, she felt a weight lift that she hadn't even known she was carrying. Thomas deserves real friendships, not just scheduled playdates with other executives' kids, and honestly, I think Danny could teach him some things that are more important than what he's learning at his expensive preschool. Thomas let out a whoop of excitement and immediately started planning the robot building session with Danny, their voices overlapping in that joyful chaos of children making friends. Margaret's eyes had filled with tears again. You have no idea what this means to him, to us. Danny doesn't have many friends, kids at school. They can be cruel about being poor. But your boy, he just sees another kid, not someone to look down on. That's because Thomas has a better heart than I do, Rebecca said honestly. He knew immediately to share the croissant. I was too busy being paralyzed by social anxiety and worried about appearances. But you're here now, Margaret pointed out. You could have left after ordering breakfast, could have thrown money at the problem and walked away. But you stayed. You listened. That counts for something. Rebecca's phone buzzed again. Another text, another email, the digital world demanding her attention, her submission to its relentless pace. She looked at the screen and saw her entire life compressed into notifications. Meetings missed, deadlines approaching, expectations unmet, people waiting, systems requiring her participation. And then she looked up and saw Thomas and Danny building a napkin fort on the table, Margaret watching them with a grandmother's fond indulgence, rain still pattering against the cafe windows, the moment suspended in something that felt more real than any boardroom had ever felt. Rebecca made her choice. She opened her phone, but instead of apologizing or explaining or trying to salvage the board meeting, she typed a message to her CFO. Family emergency. Handle the board meeting without me. We'll reschedule. This is non-negotiable. Then she turned off her phone completely, not just silenced it, but powered it down, something she hadn't done during waking hours in years. The screen went black, and with it, the constant pull of her other life. Are you sure? Margaret asked, having watched this transaction with understanding eyes. No, Rebecca admitted. I'm not sure. I might be making a huge mistake. I might be sabotaging everything I've built. But I'm more sure of this than I've been of anything in a long time. They sat together for another hour, not talking about anything profound, just existing in each other's company. Margaret told stories about her sons when they were young. Rebecca talked about Thomas's obsession with dinosaurs. The boys played and laughed and built impossible structures out of sugar packets and napkins. The cafe's morning rush faded into the lunch crowd, and still they stayed. At one point, Thomas climbed into Rebecca's lap, something he rarely did anymore, having learned that Mommy was always too busy, always had somewhere else to be. But now, feeling perhaps that something had shifted, that his mother was actually present for once, he curled against her chest and she wrapped her arms around him and felt the weight of what she'd been missing. I love you, Mommy, he whispered. I love you too, sweetheart, she whispered back, and meant it with an intensity that made her throat tight. I'm sorry I've been gone so much. I'm going to try to do better. Okay, Thomas said simply, with the easy forgiveness of a child who just wanted to be chosen, to matter, to be seen. When they finally left the cafe, Rebecca exchanged phone numbers with Margaret. Actual phone numbers, not LinkedIn connections or Instagram follows, but the kind of contact information that meant real relationship, real commitment to staying in touch. "Thank you," Rebecca said as they stood under the cafe's awning, rain still falling around them, "for teaching me something important today." "I didn't teach you anything you didn't already know," Margaret replied. "I just helped you remember." In Dessern, as Rebecca drove home with Thomas, chattering in the back seat about his new friend Danny and the robots they were going to build, she felt different. Lighter somehow, despite knowing she'd probably face serious consequences at work for missing the board meeting. She'd chosen Thomas over her career, chosen presence over productivity, chosen what mattered over what seemed urgent. Her phone, still powered off in her purse, remained silent. The world hadn't ended because she'd been unreachable for 2 hours. The company would survive without her constant oversight. The board meeting would happen again. But this morning with Thomas, this moment of actually being present with her son, this chance to learn from Margaret's hard-won wisdom, these things could never be replicated or rescheduled. That evening, after putting Thomas to bed, Rebecca sat at her home office desk and looked at the life she'd built with new eyes. The success still mattered. She'd worked too hard to pretend it didn't, but it couldn't be the only thing that mattered. It couldn't cost her the people who actually needed her, who loved her not for what she accomplished, but for who she was. She made a list. Not of business goals or strategic initiatives, but of changes she needed to make, real changes, not the vague promises she'd made to herself before. Block out Thomas's school events in her calendar as non-negotiable. Leave work by 6 p.m. at least 3 days a week. Have dinner with Thomas every night she wasn't traveling. Actually take her vacation days. Visit Margaret and Danny on the weekend. As promised, simple things. Things that shouldn't have required a list but did, because she'd let her life become so unbalanced that basic human connection had become a radical act. 3 weeks later, Rebecca did face consequences at work. The board meeting she'd missed had not gone well. She'd lost the immediate opportunity for venture capital funding. 2 board members had privately suggested she might not be the right leader for the company's next phase, that perhaps someone with more dedication was needed. The old Rebecca would have panicked, would have worked 80-hour weeks to prove her commitment, would have sacrificed everything to rebuild her reputation. The new Rebecca, or perhaps the real Rebecca, finally surfacing after years of performance, made a different choice. She stepped down as CEO and took a position as Chief Product Officer, a role with less pressure and more regular hours. She took a pay cut. She gave up some of her equity. She accepted that her career trajectory had fundamentally changed, and she discovered something unexpected. She was happier. Thomas was happier too. He had a mother who showed up to his soccer games, who helped with his homework, who was present for dinner instead of distracted by emails. He and Danny had become inseparable friends, and through that friendship, Rebecca and Margaret had built a relationship that enriched both their lives. Rebecca learning about resilience and gratitude from Margaret. Margaret gaining a friend who could help navigate bureaucratic systems and occasionally provide support when money got too tight. On a rainy Tuesday morning, 6 months after that first encounter in the cafe, Rebecca found herself back at the same corner booth. But this time, Margaret sat across from her by choice, not necessity. This time, they both had full plates of food. This time, they were simply 2 friends sharing breakfast, sharing stories, sharing their lives. Thomas and Danny were at the next table over, building an elaborate structure out of sugar packets, their laughter bright and easy. Rebecca watched them and felt a contentment she'd never experienced during her most successful business quarters. "No regrets?" Margaret asked, as if reading her thoughts. Rebecca considered the question honestly. She'd given up the CEO title, the prestigious speaking engagements, the Forbes articles, the constant validation that she was important, successful, winning at the game of life. She'd traded the corner office for something harder to quantify. "None," Rebecca said, and meant it. "I finally understand what you tried to tell me that first day. Success isn't what I thought it was. It's not the title or the money or the recognition. It's this, having time for people who matter, being present for moments that actually count, building a life that feels worth living instead of just impressive looking." Margaret smiled, that warm, weathered smile that had become so familiar. "Look at you, getting wise in your old age." Rebecca laughed. "I'm 37. "Like I said, old age," Margaret teased, and they both laughed, the easy laughter of people who'd chosen to see each other, to value each other, to build something real in a world that often felt painfully artificial. Outside, rain continued to fall on Seattle's streets, washing the city clean. The same rain that had been falling that morning 6 months ago when Rebecca's life had changed direction. But inside the cafe, in their corner booth, there was warmth and connection, and the simple, profound joy of being chosen, of choosing, of finally understanding what mattered most. Thomas looked up from his sugar packet structure and caught Rebecca's eye. He smiled, that bright, unguarded smile she'd been missing for too long, and she smiled back, present and grateful, and finally home in the life she was actually living, instead of the life she'd been performing. And in that moment, Rebecca understood the deepest truth Margaret had been trying to teach her, that the richest life isn't measured in dollars or titles or achievements, but in moments like these, simple, ordinary, and absolutely priceless.